If you've seen The Mandalorian and Grogu, you probably did a double take. Wait, that's a Hutt? Not just any Hutt. Rotta, Jabba's son. With war axes, with muscles, with the energy of a guy who wakes up at 5 in the morning to convert rage into protein. And suddenly Jabba looks like that distant relative who's been lying on his couch for 3 centuries just yelling at people because everything we thought we knew about Hutts came from Jabba, that enormous slimy creature who lounged on a throne, swallowed live frogs, and let everyone else do the actual work. Jabba wasn't active. Jabba wasn't athletic. Jabba was the galactic equivalent of a Roman emperor who at some point decided that physical exertion was for people who couldn't afford not to. But Rotta looks like someone who has to prove he's more than just Jabba's kid. And that's exactly what makes this character so interesting, because Rotta suddenly raises questions Star Wars never really answered for decades. Who were the Hutts originally? Why did they become criminal overlords? Why do some of them look like living luxury disasters, while others look like they could tear a Mandalorian apart? The answer doesn't start with Jabba. It starts over 25,000 years ago, and it tells the story of a species that may have never truly stopped being dangerous. Part 1. The first Hutts weren't gangsters, they were conquerors. Let's start with the number 25,000 BBY. That's so far back that the Republic is just barely getting started. The Jedi barely understand the Force themselves. Many worlds don't even have functioning hyperspace routes yet. And the Hutts? The Hutts already have an empire. Their original homeworld is called Varl. And on Varl, Hutts aren't lazy crime bosses. They are aggressive conquerors. They expand. They enslave entire species. They wage wars. They control star systems. And here's the first big AYOHA. The Hutts we know from the movies are probably the watered down version of their own species, because biologically, Hutts are absolute monsters. They possess enormous muscular strength, multiple lungs, an internal skeleton, extreme resistance to disease and poison. And despite their size, they can move with surprising speed. Jabba only seems harmless because Jabba had long since reached a point where he didn't need to fight anymore. That's the key. Jabba was never weak. Jabba had simply become so powerful that physical violence was beneath him. And that's exactly why Rotta suddenly makes sense, because Rotta might not be showing us an unusual Hutt. He might be showing us what Hutts originally looked like. Part 2. The War That Changed the Hutts. The early Hutt Empire was massive. Hutt space wasn't just a criminal territory. It was an independent galactic power, almost like a feudal star kingdom, a mix of crime families, trade empires, and ruling dynasties. Honestly, the Hutts in Star Wars function a lot like the Harkonnens from Dune, just slimier and probably even more corrupt. Then comes Jim the Despot, a human warlord, ambitious, brutal, and absolutely convinced he could bring the Hutts to their knees. The war between Jim and the Hutts becomes legendary. The Hutts ultimately win, but the victory costs them everything, because at some point, their homeworld Varl disappears. And this is where Star Wars lore gets surprisingly dark. The official Hutt version sounds like mythology. Varl orbited 2 suns named Ivona and Ardos. One was swallowed by a black hole, the other exploded out of grief and destroyed the entire system. Yeah, the Hutts narrate cosmic catastrophes like Greek tragedies. The more likely explanation, the Hutts destroyed their own world. Civil war, power struggles, internal conflict, maybe even planetary weapons. And suddenly, the entire history of the Hutts looks different. Because the species that would go on to control galactic crime for millennia was possibly traumatized by its own greed. Part 3. The Birth of the Khajiit. After the fall of Varl, the Hutts flee to Nal Hutta, a damp, polluted swamp planet that practically no one else wanted. The Hutts call it Glorious Jewel anyway, which has roughly the same energy as a real estate agent selling you a moldy basement as rustic charm. But Nal Hutta changes the Hutts, because this is where the philosophy that defines their society to this day is born. The Khajiit. Khajiit doesn't just mean family, it's clan, cartel, economic system, and power structure all rolled into one. And the genius of it, the Hutts stop fighting open wars, they manipulate, they bribe, they control trade routes, they use smugglers, they fund violence from the shadows. That's the second big Aohe. The Hutts didn't turn to crime because they got weaker. They turned to crime because they learned that indirect power is more effective than open conquest. Jabba wasn't the decline of Hutt culture. Jabba was its perfection. He didn't need to intimidate anyone anymore. His mere existence was enough. Part 4. Why the Republic never destroyed the Hutts. And now we get to maybe the most unsettling part, because you'd think someone would ask, why did the Hutts survive this long? The Republic was powerful, the Jedi were powerful, the Empire was powerful, and yet the Hutts outlasted all of them. Why? Because the galaxy needed them. The Hutts controlled smuggling routes, bounty hunters, slave trading, black market networks, illegal shipments, and even though everyone knew exactly how brutal they were, almost every major power in the galaxy benefited from them at some point. That's the real horror of the Hutts. Not their violence, not their corruption, but the fact that the galaxy collectively decided to look the other way for thousands of years, as long as business kept running. The Hutts in Star Wars are more than just gangsters. They're a mirror showing how easily even civilized systems ignore moral limits when power, money, and stability depend on it. Part 5. Why Jabba looked the way he did. Now Jabba's body suddenly makes a lot more sense, too. A lot of fans assume Hutts just automatically grow huge and sluggish with age, but for Hutts, mass is status. The older, richer, and more powerful a Hutt becomes, the less he needs to move himself. Others fight for him, others die for him, others bring him food. Jabba was over 600 years old. His body was essentially a living monument to his own success. A Hutt who looks like Jabba is sending one message: I have been so powerful for so long that I haven't had to make an effort in centuries. Rotta, on the other hand, is growing up in a completely different reality. The Hutt Empire is fracturing. Jabba is dead. The old power structures are crumbling. And suddenly, just being Jabba the Hutt's son isn't enough anymore. Rotta has to earn it. That's why he trains. That's why he fights. That's why he looks more like a gladiator than a classic crime lord. That wasn't an accident in the character design. That was storytelling. Part 6, from Stinky to Warrior. The craziest part? We've already seen Rotta as a baby. In the Clone Wars, back then, he was just a Huttlet. Helpless, sick, kidnapped. Ahsoka affectionately calls him Stinky, which is probably the most humiliating nickname you could give a future gladiator Hutt. And now that same character is apparently fighting in arenas, armed, dangerous, and clearly determined to never look weak again. That actually makes a surprising amount of emotional sense, because Rotta grew up after Jabba's death in a galaxy where the Hutt name is slowly losing its grip. He lives in the shadow of a father who was simultaneously legendary and despised. And right there, Rotta becomes more than just a cool side character. He becomes a symbol of a species in transition, because maybe Rotta isn't showing us the future of the Hutts. Maybe he's showing us their past. The history of the Hutts is really the story of a species that kept reinventing itself. From brutal conquerors to imperial rulers to criminal dynasties to the invisible forces behind the galactic underworld. And now, suddenly, There's Rotta standing in front of us, a Hutt who looks nothing like Jabba and doesn't operate like a classic crime boss, but like someone born into a dying dynasty, trying to figure out what strength actually means. Jabba embodied power through control. Rotta embodies power through presence, and maybe that's where the future of the Hutts lies, or their return to what they originally were. Because in the end, the most dangerous family in the galaxy was maybe never truly weak. They just got comfortable.